The sweet smell of chemical revenge mixed with the acrid stench of dying grass as I watched Regina Blackstone's pristine front yard transform into a toxic wasteland of her own making. There, I stood on my driveway, sipping my morning coffee while nature delivered the most poetic justice I'd ever witnessed. Her $15,000 professional landscaping crumbling under the weight of illegal pesticides she'd been secretly dumping to maintain that magazine-perfect appearance, not knowing she was about to learn that karma has a chemistry degree and a sense of humor darker than her soul. 6 months earlier, this power-drunk HOA dictator had declared war on my rooftop solar installation, apparently believing that clean energy threatened her vision of suburban conformity. What would you do if your HOA president tried to force you to choose between environmental responsibility and keeping your home? Drop a comment telling me your thoughts and smash that subscribe button for more stories of neighborhood justice that'll restore your faith in cosmic balance. My name is David Chen, and last spring I thought installing solar panels would be the smartest financial decision of my engineering career. 27 high-efficiency panels generating enough clean electricity to power 2 homes, slashing my utility bills to practically nothing while adding $40,000 in property value to my house in Westfield Estates. Those black beauties gleaming on my south-facing roof represented everything I believed in: environmental responsibility, energy independence, and sticking it to corporate utility monopolies that had been robbing homeowners blind for decades. More than just an investment, those panels were my middle finger to climate change deniers and fossil fuel addicts who thought burning coal was somehow more patriotic than harnessing free sunlight. After 15 years designing renewable energy systems for municipalities across Colorado, I knew solar technology inside out. Peak efficiency ratings, inverter compatibility, grid tie protocols, and most importantly, the legal frameworks protecting homeowner rights to clean energy that politicians had been strengthening for over a decade. The installation was bulletproof, both technically and legally. Colorado's Solar Rights Act prohibited HOAs from banning or unreasonably restricting solar installations. Period. Federal tax incentives, state rebates, and utility company net metering agreements created a financial ecosystem that made solar practically mandatory for anyone with half a brain and a calculator. My panels weren't just environmentally responsible, they were generating measurable wealth while reducing carbon emissions that my kids Emma and Sophie would thank me for when they inherited a planet not completely destroyed by short-sighted energy policies. Then Regina Blackstone slithered into our neighborhood like a perfectly manicured plague, wearing designer suits and wielding manufactured authority like a weapon against anyone who threatened her narrow vision of suburban perfection. Picture a woman who'd relocated from Texas oil money with enough inherited wealth to buy the most expensive McMansion in Westfield Estates and sufficient entitlement to believe that made her neighborhood empress with divine right to control every visible aspect of other people's property. Her husband Gerald owns 3 luxury car dealerships and collects vintage Porsches, like trophies compensating for personality deficits that expensive therapy couldn't fix. Within 4 months of arriving, Regina had maneuvered herself into the HOA presidency through a combination of intimidation, bribery, and exploiting bylaws that most residents had never bothered reading. Her first official act was launching what could only be described as an aesthetic cleansing campaign disguised as property value protection. This woman possessed supernatural talent for identifying anything that didn't conform to her sterile vision of suburban uniformity, then systematically destroying it through fees, violations, and harassment campaigns that would make dictators proud. Her expensive perfume couldn't mask the stench of petty tyranny that poisoned our once peaceful community like toxic groundwater seeping through perfectly manicured lawns. The war officially began with a certified letter that made my blood pressure spike just reading the return address. Regina demanded immediate removal of my unsightly industrial equipment within 30 days or face $750 daily fines, claiming solar panels violated our community's residential aesthetic standards and posed structural safety risks to neighboring properties. The woman was literally arguing that harvesting free sunlight constituted a public nuisance requiring expensive legal intervention. When I knocked on her door with Colorado Solar Rights Act documentation and offered reasonable visual screening solutions like decorative railings or landscape buffers, she wouldn't even pretend to examine the legal protections. Precedent cannot be set for industrial equipment on residential rooftops, she declared, standing in her marble foyer wearing $1,000 heels that clicked on imported Italian tile like a countdown timer to my family's financial destruction. Her reign of terror had already claimed multiple victims, and I'd watched the systematic pattern emerge with growing disgust. Tom Rodriguez, a decorated Air Force veteran whose American flag display honored fallen comrades, was bullied into removing his memorial garden because it allegedly attracted undesirable wildlife, despite being native Colorado plants recommended by the State Agriculture Extension Office. Lisa Park, a young mother juggling twins and night school, received harassment about her vegetable garden during her final exams week because Regina decided homegrown food was agricultural activity inappropriate for residential neighborhoods. Elderly widower Frank Morrison, who'd spent 40 years maintaining the most beautiful flower beds in 3 counties, got cited for excessive garden ornamentation after installing bird feeders that brought joy to his lonely retirement. But Regina's cruelty reached peak psychopathy when she threatened violation notices against Maria Santos for parking her work van in her own driveway, despite Maria being an EMT whose emergency vehicle literally saved lives during medical crises. 5 families had already surrendered, spending thousands on unnecessary modifications just to make Regina's harassment stop, feeding her addiction to other people's submission like a suburban vampire feeding on compliance and fear. But I'd spent 15 years engineering renewable energy systems, and I understood something this fossil fuel princess didn't. When you try to block clean energy that's protected by state and federal law, you don't just face angry homeowners. You face regulatory agencies with enforcement powers that make HOA fines look like parking tickets. Regina Blackstone had picked the wrong engineer to mess with, and she was about to learn that solar power isn't just about electricity generation, it's about energy independence, environmental justice, and fighting back against exactly the kind of corporate-sponsored authoritarianism she represented. Regina wasted no time escalating from passive-aggressive letters to full-scale legal warfare designed to bankrupt me into submission. 2 weeks after our doorstep confrontation, she convened an emergency HOA board meeting scheduled during business hours when working people couldn't attend, a classic authoritarian tactic I'd seen deployed by every petty dictator who'd ever discovered Robert's Rules of Order. The meeting was pure political theater, with her 3 hand-picked cronies nodding like dashboard ornaments, while she presented a PowerPoint claiming my solar installation created visual pollution that threatened property values and neighborhood character. The 4-1 vote to enforce immediate panel removal was as rigged as a carnival game, with only conscience-driven board member Patricia Williams dissenting, because she still remembered what integrity looked like in public service. Within 72 hours, I received a cease and desist letter from attorneys who probably charged more per hour than most families' monthly income, claiming my panels violated restrictive covenants about architectural modifications that supposedly superseded state solar rights protections. Here's something most homeowners don't realize about HOA intimidation tactics. They'll cite legal authorities that either don't exist or don't apply to your situation, counting on you being too overwhelmed to research actual law versus manufactured legal-sounding threats. When people call attorneys to verify these supposed covenant violations, they get quoted hourly rates that make resistance seem financially impossible, assuming the expensive legal consultation proves the HOA's claims are legitimate. It's economic warfare disguised as contract enforcement. And it works because most folks don't have the time, money, or energy to fight organizations with deep pockets and unlimited appetite for litigation against individual homeowners. But Regina's biggest mistake was underestimating how much neighbors hate watching environmental progress get destroyed by fossil fuel-funded authoritarianism. When I organized a community meeting at Sunrise Coffee Company, 37 people showed up on a Wednesday evening, and their stories revealed systematic harassment that made my solar panel persecution look mild by comparison. The aroma of fresh coffee and homemade pastries couldn't sweeten the bitter taste of learning how comprehensively Regina had terrorized families whose only crime was failing to conform to her sterile suburban aesthetic. Tom Rodriguez's voice shook with suppressed rage as he described destroying his memorial garden, plants chosen specifically because they attracted native butterflies his deceased squadron leader had loved during peaceful moments between combat missions. Lisa Park fought back tears explaining how Regina had threatened daily fines during her nursing school finals week, demanding she remove tomato plants that fed her family healthy food while student loans left little money for organic groceries. The pattern that emerged was pure protection, racket psychology disguised as community standards enforcement. Friends of Regina received gentle warnings about potential violations, while anyone on her target list got immediate fines and legal threats. Her selective enforcement was so blatant it bordered on parody, except it was bankrupting decent people trying to live responsible lives in their own homes. My engineering background kicked into high gear as I researched our legal position with the thoroughness of someone designing critical infrastructure. The Colorado Solar Rights Act was ironclad. HOAs could impose reasonable restrictions on solar installations, but couldn't ban them or make them economically unfeasible through excessive requirements. Even better, state regulatory agencies actively investigated HOA solar violations and imposed penalties that made Regina's fines look like pocket change. The federal solar investment tax credit represented 30% of installation costs, meaning government policy actively encouraged exactly what Regina was trying to prohibit. Utility company net metering agreements were legally protected contracts that HOAs had zero authority to interfere with, period. Armed with bulletproof documentation and growing community support, I filed complaints with the Colorado Public Utilities Commission while local environmental groups launched a solar rights defense fund that collected $15,000 in donations within 2 weeks. Even my ex-wife Jennifer called offering legal research assistance, which should have been my first clue that public opinion was swinging hard against Regina's anti-environmental dictatorship. The woman had overplayed her hand so spectacularly that she'd united Democrats and Republicans, young families and retirees, longtime residents and newcomers in shared disgust at her tactics. Then came the revelation that changed everything. Regina's response to organized community resistance wasn't compromise or retreat. It was escalating to environmental terrorism disguised as emergency action. Regina's war against clean energy escalated from harassment to corporate sabotage when she contacted my employer, claiming I was creating workplace liability issues with my illegal residential modifications, and suggesting they might want to reconsider my fitness for municipal renewable energy projects. The woman was literally trying to destroy my career because I wouldn't surrender my constitutional right to harvest sunlight on my own property. When that failed to break me, she filed false complaints with the city building department claiming my solar installation violated structural safety codes and posed fire hazards requiring immediate municipal intervention. The bitter irony was that her own unpermitted deck addition, the one clearly visible in satellite photos but mysteriously absent from city records, violated actual building codes while she weaponized government agencies against a professionally installed system that exceeded all safety requirements. Regina's biggest tactical error was dragging building inspector Carlos Mendez into her personal vendetta. When the city fire safety officer arrived expecting dangerous electrical violations, he found a textbook installation that exceeded national standards and included safety features most homeowners never bothered with. The sight of my clearly labeled disconnect switches, properly grounded mounting systems, and professional electrical work made it obvious that Regina's complaint was pure malicious fiction designed to waste municipal resources. Even better, Carlos was a renewable energy enthusiast who immediately recognized the high-efficiency panels and microinverter technology that represented cutting-edge solar engineering. His official report didn't just clear my installation of safety violations. It recommended my setup as a model for other residential solar projects and noted the frivolous nature of the complaint that brought him there. The city vindication triggered something beautiful. My professional network mobilized like an army of engineers defending clean energy progress. Dr. Amanda Walsh, a solar technology expert I'd collaborated with on municipal projects, volunteered comprehensive testing that proved my system generated more clean electricity per square foot than most commercial installations. The performance data showed peak efficiency ratings that made my panels a showcase of renewable energy technology working exactly as designed. Word spread through industry conferences, turning Regina into a cautionary tale about HOA environmental obstruction that resonated with professionals who understood clean energy law and climate change urgency. Meanwhile, Regina hired private investigator Steve Morrison to excavate dirt from my personal life, apparently convinced that destroying my reputation would somehow legitimize her anti-solar crusade. Steve, a retired detective who took pride in ethical investigation, spent 3 weeks researching my background and came up completely empty for scandal. Instead, he discovered I volunteered with local environmental education programs, maintained a spotless professional reputation, and that my grandfather was a renewable energy pioneer who'd built Colorado's first residential wind generator in 1979. The investigation backfire revealed something even more damaging to Regina's cause. When Steve told her no scandalous evidence existed, she'd explicitly asked him to interpret normal environmental activism as extremist behavior, and suggested he might find creative ways to make my clean energy advocacy look suspicious or unpatriotic. That conversation changed everything. Steve's written statement documenting Regina's attempt to manufacture evidence gave my attorney, Rebecca Martinez, ammunition for harassment lawsuits and potential criminal charges for conspiracy to commit defamation. The woman had become so desperate to destroy me that she'd tried bribing a licensed investigator into creating false evidence, crossing the line from harassment into felony territory. But her most catastrophic mistake was still coming. In escalating desperation, Regina began recruiting new residents with promises of reduced HOA fees in exchange for supporting her anti-solar campaign. She was so blinded by arrogance that she failed to research her targets, accidentally approaching Dr. Michael Harrison, an environmental lawyer who'd just moved in 3 blocks away. When Michael heard Regina's recruitment pitch about eliminating industrial equipment that threatens neighborhood character, he didn't just decline to help. He offered to represent solar homeowners pro bono against what he recognized as clear violations of state renewable energy protections. The amateur dictator had accidentally recruited her own legal nemesis, and the sweet taste of impending victory was mixing with crisp mountain air as I watched her carefully constructed campaign crumble under its own ignorance of environmental law. Regina's response to organized resistance was declaring total war through an emergency HOA board meeting scheduled with barely 12 hours' notice, a flagrant violation of bylaws requiring 72 hours for non-emergency matters. The agenda item that made my blood run cold was a proposed $25,000 special assessment on my property for environmental compliance consulting fees, which was basically legalized extortion disguised as community protection. Even more audacious, she threatened foreclosure proceedings for my repeated covenant violations, apparently believing that screaming legal-sounding nonsense in front of witnesses would somehow override state and federal solar rights protections. The stench of her desperation was getting stronger than the chemical fertilizers she used to maintain that unnaturally green lawn. The poison lawn revelation came when my neighbor, Jake Patterson, a chemistry professor at Colorado State, noticed Regina's grass staying perfectly green during a drought that had turned everyone else's yards brown, despite water restrictions. His professional curiosity led to soil testing that revealed illegal pesticide concentrations 50 times higher than EPA safety limits. Regina had been secretly dumping commercial-grade chemicals banned for residential use, creating toxic contamination that would require expensive environmental remediation and potentially criminal prosecution under federal hazardous waste laws. The woman who'd spent months claiming my clean energy installation threatened neighborhood safety had been poisoning groundwater with chemicals so dangerous they required hazmat disposal. Dr. Harrison's environmental law expertise turned Regina's chemical contamination into a nuclear bomb of legal liability. Not only had she violated federal environmental protection laws, but her toxic lawn represented exactly the kind of pollution that solar energy was designed to prevent by reducing dependence on fossil fuel electricity generation. The media explosion began when Channel 7 News requested an interview after my Facebook post about Regina's chemical lawn reached 75,000 views in 8 hours. Sitting under those blazing studio lights with the antiseptic smell of television makeup making me dizzy, I explained how one person's abuse of HOA authority could destroy environmental progress unless communities stood up with knowledge and determination. The story spread to environmental websites and generated thousands of comments from homeowners sharing similar horror stories about anti-solar harassment by officials who'd apparently never heard of climate change or clean energy incentives that made renewable installations practically mandatory for responsible citizens. Regina's panic response was a scripted Facebook video filmed in her chemically perfect backyard that collected criticism faster than a climate change denial conference. She claimed victimhood in a coordinated harassment campaign by environmental extremists threatening property values and community standards, while standing in front of grass so artificially green it looked like astroturf painted with toxic waste. The comment section became a battlefield where neighbors shared photos of her chemical application equipment, documentation of groundwater contamination, and evidence of selective enforcement that made her look less like a community leader and more like an environmental criminal watching her toxic empire collapse in real time. The anonymous package that destroyed Regina's entire world appeared on my doorstep like a gift from environmental justice angels. The thick manila envelope felt heavy with secrets as I carried it inside with my morning coffee, and when I opened it, photographs spilled across my kitchen table like evidence in an ecological crime thriller. What I saw made my engineering brain explode with possibilities while my environmental conscience screamed for justice. Detailed shots of Regina's garage showing industrial-sized containers of banned pesticides, illegal chemical storage systems, and application equipment that belonged on commercial agricultural operations, not residential properties. The technical implications hit me like lightning bolts of vindication. Regina's $30,000 lawn maintenance operation hadn't just violated environmental protection laws, it had created groundwater contamination that threatened the entire neighborhood's drinking water while generating carbon emissions equivalent to running 3 cars year-round. Her chemical obsession included banned organophosphates linked to cancer, endocrine disruptors that caused developmental problems in children, and nitrogen compounds that created algae blooms in downstream waterways. The woman who'd spent months claiming my solar panels threatened community health had been poisoning our environment with chemicals so dangerous they required professional hazmat certification for legal application. The anonymous photos included purchase receipts showing she'd been buying commercial pesticides during EPA review periods, meaning procurement violated federal regulations about residential chemical use. Even more damaging, billing records showed payments to unlicensed applicators who'd been dumping restricted chemicals without environmental permits or safety protocols. When I cross-referenced the chemical application timeline with county health department water quality reports, the correlation was devastating. Groundwater contamination levels had spiked dramatically in our area, beginning exactly 3 weeks after Regina's intensive lawn treatment program started. Her pursuit of aesthetic perfection had created environmental damage that would persist for decades while my solar panels generated clean electricity without producing a single molecule of pollution. Rebecca Martinez practically glowed with prosecutorial satisfaction when I spread the evidence across her conference table. David, this isn't just environmental violation, this is federal environmental crime with serious criminal penalties. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act makes illegal disposal of hazardous chemicals a felony carrying up to $50,000 in daily fines plus potential imprisonment. The legal implications were staggering. EPA enforcement action, mandatory environmental remediation costing hundreds of thousands of dollars, personal liability for neighborhood health impacts, and potential criminal charges for contaminating municipal water supplies. Most homeowners never realize that major chemical applications often require environmental permits that cost tens of thousands of dollars because altering natural ecosystem chemistry can affect entire watersheds and neighboring properties. Regina had skipped this process entirely, creating liability that would follow her forever and insurance exclusions that left her financially naked when the consequences arrived. But the most beautiful revelation was how completely this flipped our environmental positions. Regina had spent months claiming my clean energy installation threatened community welfare, while her own chemical warfare caused every environmental problem she'd tried to blame on renewable technology. Her toxic lawn now represented massive liability that insurance wouldn't cover due to illegal chemical use, and compliance would require complete soil replacement and groundwater remediation that could cost more than her house was worth. The war council that would destroy Regina's toxic empire met at Mountain View Diner on a crisp Thursday morning where the smell of organic coffee mixed with the intoxicating aroma of environmental justice. Rebecca Martinez commandeered our corner booth like a prosecutor preparing for environmental victory, spreading legal documents across the checkered tablecloth while Dr. Harrison organized regulatory violations with surgical precision. Steve Morrison's ethical investigation had provided evidence that transformed Regina from complainant to criminal defendant, while my documentation project had evolved into a comprehensive archive of environmental crime disguised as lawn care. The visual evidence would devastate any jury. Pristine solar panels generating clean electricity contrasted against chemical contamination equipment and poisoned groundwater reports. David, we're not just fighting back, we're going environmental nuclear, Rebecca announced, her eyes gleaming with prosecutorial determination. Federal environmental crime charges, state chemical violation reports, and civil litigation for health damages in a legal strategy that'll crush Regina from multiple regulatory directions simultaneously. Dr. Harrison had weaponized his environmental law expertise into the most comprehensive clean energy defense Colorado had ever seen. Your solar installation doesn't just comply with state renewable energy protections, it represents exactly the kind of environmental responsibility that federal climate policy actively encourages. Regina's chemical contamination has violated protocols designed to prevent exactly the ecological damage that clean energy technology helps avoid. The media momentum had exploded beyond local environmental news into national symbols of grassroots renewable energy defense. CNN's investigative series on HOA environmental obstruction featured my solar panels as clean technology fighting suburban chemical pollution, with footage of children playing safely near renewable energy installations contrasted against hazmat teams cleaning up toxic lawn contamination. Environmental groups nationwide shared our story, turning neighborhood drama into a case study of how ordinary citizens can protect climate progress through documentation and persistence while exposing the environmental hypocrisy of officials who prioritize aesthetic control over planetary health. Regina's final descent into environmental criminality began with midnight chemical applications that made my blood boil when I reviewed security footage the next morning. The timestamp read 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday when she and some hired crew crept through our neighborhood like toxic terrorists, armed with commercial spray equipment and industrial chemicals that belonged on agricultural operations, not residential properties. The night vision footage showed her directing illegal pesticide applications while wearing protective equipment that looked like hazmat gear, apparently believing that poisoning neighborhood groundwater under cover of darkness would somehow legitimize her war against clean energy technology. The sight of her spacesuit-like chemical protection gear contrasted against my family's unprotected exposure to her toxic contamination was enough to make any parent demand immediate criminal prosecution. Sheriff Deputy Williams caught them during a routine patrol when neighbors reported suspicious chemical odors that burned their throats and made their children nauseous. His spotlight illuminated Regina's masked face like an environmental terrorist trapped in the act of chemical warfare, while her hired applicators fled into darkness when they spotted law enforcement approaching their illegal operation. The evidence of criminal environmental contamination was overwhelming. Unlabeled chemical containers, professional spray equipment, and soil samples that would later test positive for banned substances at concentrations that required evacuation and professional remediation. Regina's explanation that she was protecting community property values through preventive landscape maintenance sounded psychotic when delivered through a respirator mask while children in nearby houses were developing respiratory symptoms from her chemical exposure. But Regina's most catastrophic error came when desperation drove her to attempt bribing Environmental Compliance Officer Janet Torres into providing fraudulent safety assessments. Janet, a career environmental protection professional who'd built her reputation on scientific integrity, secretly recorded the entire conversation where Regina offered $10,000 cash for a report claiming my solar panels posed environmental hazards. All you have to do is interpret normal renewable energy technology as potentially problematic, Regina instructed Janet, her voice pitched with desperation that made environmental protection sound like criminal conspiracy. Emphasize theoretical risks about electromagnetic emissions or aesthetic pollution. I'll handle the legal aspects once we have official documentation supporting panel removal. When Janet refused and threatened to report the attempted bribery, Regina's environmental mask slipped completely as she screamed about industrial equipment destroying neighborhood character, before storming out like a chemical-addled suburbanite whose aesthetic obsession had completely disconnected her from environmental reality. Janet's ethical backbone proved stronger than Regina's corruption, and her written statement documenting attempted bribery of environmental officials gave us ammunition for federal conspiracy charges that would follow Regina long after our solar litigation ended. The recording captured explicit instructions to manufacture false environmental evidence, create fraudulent safety justifications, and circumvent renewable energy protections through perjured testimony. Community environmental surveillance had evolved beyond neighbor communication into sophisticated documentation of Regina's increasingly desperate chemical warfare. Mrs. Patterson witnessed her photographing other residents' gardens without permission, apparently expanding harassment campaigns to anyone who'd supported renewable energy initiatives. Jake Rodriguez recorded audio of intimidation attempts against elderly homeowners, threatening property assessments and environmental citations if they didn't support anti-solar petitions. Patricia documented systematic HOA procedural violations as Regina abandoned democratic governance in favor of unilateral environmental edicts, issued like some toxic dictator whose grip on power dissolved with every desperate chemical application. The incident that sealed Regina's environmental fate occurred when she called county emergency services, claiming my solar panels had caused electromagnetic contamination, requiring immediate hazmat response. Environmental emergency teams responding to the supposed crisis instead found Regina's chemical contamination that required actual hazmat protocols, with soil toxicity levels so extreme that children couldn't safely play in affected areas. The official incident report didn't just debunk her electromagnetic claims. It documented a pattern of filing false environmental reports while simultaneously creating actual chemical hazards that threatened community health. Environmental Protection Agency investigators classified Regina's contamination as willful violation of hazardous waste protocols with aggravating factors including false reporting and obstruction of environmental enforcement. Building department pressure reached critical mass when formal citations established deadlines for environmental remediation or facing escalating daily fines that compounded faster than toxic chemical accumulation. Her required soil replacement and groundwater treatment carried minimum costs exceeding $200,000 with timelines extending beyond any reasonable financial recovery period. Insurance companies had denied coverage for illegal chemical contamination, leaving Regina financially naked as environmental consequences accelerated beyond her ability to control or contain through legal manipulation. Her final gambit revealed itself Friday evening when the rumble of commercial chemical trucks positioning near neighborhood water sources announced her intention to commit the most brazen environmental crime in Colorado HOA history. The plan was breathtakingly criminal: emergency chemical treatment of common areas during my scheduled weekend conference in Denver, creating environmental contamination so extensive that solar panel health concerns would seem legitimate by comparison. She'd recruited Gerald's dealership employees as volunteer applicators, apparently believing that calling environmental terrorism a community safety project would somehow legitimize poisoning our neighborhood's groundwater while I was supposedly safely away. My counter-operation required canceling professional obligations and orchestrating the most comprehensive response to environmental crime our county had ever witnessed. Simultaneous calls to Sheriff Deputy Williams, EPA Officer Torres, and Channel 7. Environmental investigation created a multi-agency response that would transform Regina's planned contamination into the most documented HOA environmental crime in state history. Saturday morning's confrontation began when chemical trucks roared to life at dawn like toxic monsters awakening to feed on pristine environment. Regina arrived in full protective gear, apparently believing that hazmat equipment would legitimize federal environmental crimes committed in broad daylight before dozens of witnesses and news cameras. The crew supervisor, Miguel Santos, a licensed environmental contractor who'd handled legitimate chemical applications for 2 decades, examined my renewable energy documentation and EPA chemical violation reports before flatly refusing to proceed. "Lady, this is protected renewable energy with federal climate incentives. You want environmental felonies? Get federal permits, because I'm not sacrificing my contractor's license for your neighborhood chemical warfare." The environmental cavalry arrived like something from an ecological thriller, with Deputy Williams serving cease and desist orders, while EPA Officer Torres threatened immediate criminal prosecution under federal hazardous waste provisions, carrying $50,000 daily fines for illegal chemical applications in residential areas without environmental permits. Environmental Inspector Thompson confirmed that chemical modifications to community areas required approvals from county, state, and federal agencies that Regina had never contacted, much less convinced to authorize ecological contamination. The chemical crew evacuated faster than hazmat technicians fleeing radiation leaks, demanding immediate payment for canceled services, while Regina's face cycled through color changes that would have impressed environmental chemists studying toxic exposure symptoms. But the twist that destroyed Regina's last shred of environmental credibility came when Gerald himself appeared at the confrontation to publicly denounce his wife's chemical terrorism. Standing before 50 neighbors, news cameras, and environmental enforcement officials, he announced that Regina had hidden $80,000 in environmental violation fines and remediation costs that threatened their family's financial survival. "My wife has lost perspective about environmental responsibility," he declared, his voice shaking with shame and ecological awareness. "These solar panels represent exactly the clean energy future our community needs, and poisoning our groundwater won't solve the chemical problems she created with illegal contamination." The sight of her own husband choosing environmental protection over toxic loyalty sent Regina into a meltdown that transformed our subdivision into an amphitheater of environmental justice. Screaming at law enforcement about government conspiracy while threatening to sue the EPA itself, she accused everyone from the sheriff to environmental scientists of being part of my clean energy terrorist network. Her performance was captured by smartphones and environmental news cameras as she transitioned from suburban chemical warrior to clinical case study in environmental psychosis, her expensive hazmat gear wilting under Colorado sun, while she ranted about constitutional rights she'd systematically violated and environmental authority she'd criminally abused for months. Community environmental celebration erupted as neighbors realized they were witnessing the end of chemical tyranny that had poisoned families for over a year. Children held clean energy saves. Signs made in environmental science class, while parents live-streamed the meltdown to social media platforms that amplified local environmental victory into viral inspiration for renewable energy communities nationwide. The emergency HOA meeting that would destroy Regina's toxic empire packed Westfield Community Center beyond fire code capacity, with 180 residents cramming into a space designed for 75 people who'd been environmentally terrorized into silence for too long. The electric smell of nervous anticipation mixed with the sweet aroma of environmental justice as neighbors who'd suffered months of chemical harassment finally gathered to witness clean energy democracy in action. Channel 7. Environmental News broadcast live coverage while 3 environmental reporters documented proceedings that would determine whether communities could reclaim legitimate environmental governance from chemical dictators drunk on aesthetic authority and toxic power. County Environmental Commissioner Dr. Sarah Kim attended as official observer due to statewide media attention our renewable energy defense had generated, while EPA Officer Torres positioned herself strategically to maintain order during what everyone sensed would be explosive environmental confrontation. Regina's entrance 30 minutes late was pure environmental theater, full business attire with designer briefcase that probably contained more environmental violations than most corporate polluters accumulate in decades. But the effect resembled a deposed chemical dictator arriving at her own environmental trial. She immediately demanded closed executive session to exclude environmental media and residents from witnessing her final desperate maneuvers. But the motion died without support as even her formerly loyal board members abandoned the sinking ship of her environmental credibility. The environmental nuclear bomb exploded when Treasurer Patricia revealed that Regina's personal chemical warfare against renewable energy had consumed $120,000 in community funds, completely bankrupting the HOA while enriching environmental contractors and attorneys who'd encouraged her increasingly criminal behavior. This board was never authorized to wage chemical warfare against clean energy using community money, Patricia announced with the moral authority of someone who'd taught environmental science for 30 years. Mrs. Blackstone has committed environmental crimes disguised as community service, and every family here is now facing assessments to repair the ecological damage her toxic obsession has caused. My presentation felt like delivering environmental murder trial-closing arguments to a jury that had witnessed chemical crimes firsthand. professional slides documenting harassment timeline, federal solar rights proving renewable energy precedents, environmental protection evidence, and toxic contamination confirmations created visual testimony that made Regina's chemical criminality undeniable. The contrast between clean renewable energy supporting environmental health and chemical terrorism poisoning neighborhood groundwater was so stark that several elderly residents audibly gasped at security footage showing environmental assault attempts with banned substances. Community environmental testimony transformed the meeting into a truth commission where victims finally confronted their chemical tormentor in public forum. Tom Rodriguez's trembling voice described destroying his memorial garden under Regina's threats, while Lisa Park fought tears explaining vegetable garden harassment during her nursing school environmental health courses. 18 residents shared stories of chemical exposure, selective environmental enforcement, and ecological intimidation that painted a comprehensive picture of systematic environmental abuse disguised as neighborhood improvement. The accumulated testimony made it clear that attacking renewable energy was just the most visible example of chemical tyranny that had contaminated our entire community. But the moment that ended Regina's toxic reign forever came when Rebecca Martinez approached the microphone carrying environmental evidence that would change everything. The room fell silent as she opened EPA letterhead and began reading. The Colorado Environmental Protection Agency has filed criminal charges against Regina Blackstone for hazardous waste violations, illegal chemical contamination, environmental fraud, and conspiracy to obstruct renewable energy development. The words hit like thunder in absolute silence before exploding into cheers that shook the building's environmental foundations. Federal EPA investigators have recommended prosecution under Clean Water Act provisions carrying up to 7 years imprisonment and $500,000 in environmental fines, Rebecca continued as Regina's face went white as toxic chemical foam. Additionally, the Environmental Crimes Task Force has opened investigations into systematic environmental harassment, and the State Environmental Commission is pursuing felony charges for filing false contamination reports while simultaneously creating actual chemical hazards. Regina's environmental meltdown was spectacular enough to become viral environmental education content. Screaming about government environmental conspiracy and clean energy terrorism, she accused everyone from the sheriff to the EPA of being part of my renewable energy criminal network, while threatening environmental lawsuits against every person supporting clean technology. Her performance was captured by multiple environmental cameras as she transitioned from suburban chemical dictator to unhinged environmental criminal defendant, her expensive business suit wilting under community center lights, while she ranted about constitutional rights she'd environmentally violated for months and clean energy authority she'd chemically abused through toxic contamination. When Environmental Safety Coordinator Bits Githrich Wilson moved proceedings outside due to chemical contamination concerns, the celebration atmosphere resembled an environmental block party where the neighborhood chemical bully had finally been exposed and environmentally defeated. Gerald's public environmental betrayal provided the final twist that completed Regina's toxic destruction. Taking the microphone while his wife shrieked environmental conspiracies in background, he announced their immediate divorce proceedings and his cooperation with environmental criminal investigations. "My wife has become someone who prioritizes lawn aesthetics over environmental health," he declared to stunned silence. "Her obsession with chemical perfection has poisoned our family's future, and I won't let her drag me down with her environmental criminal behavior." The sight of her own husband choosing environmental protection over toxic loyalty sent Regina into chemical hysterics that required environmental medical attention as hazmat paramedics arrived to treat what appeared to be complete toxic psychological breakdown. The final vote removing Regina from all environmental positions passed unanimously while she ranted from a stretcher about environmental conspiracy and renewable energy betrayal, creating footage that clean energy groups would use for years as examples of how organized communities can defeat environmental corruption through persistence and documentation. 3 years later, the Environmental Victory Festival draws thousands of visitors who celebrate both renewable energy conservation and democratic environmental governance with activities ranging from solar panel demonstrations and environmental education to workshops on citizen environmental advocacy and clean energy organizing. Local environmental businesses sponsor educational booths while children participate in renewable energy science projects that decorate the community solar garden Gerald donated as environmental compensation for his ex-wife's chemical crimes. My speaking engagements at environmental conferences and renewable energy universities focus on practical strategies for fighting institutional environmental obstruction, while protecting clean energy resources that belong to future generations, not just chemical corporations and aesthetically obsessed officials who view renewable technology as obstacles to toxic suburban conformity. The annual Environmental Justice Awards ceremony recognizes communities nationwide that have defeated environmental harassment while advancing clean energy adoption through documentation, persistence, and democratic environmental action that proves ordinary citizens can protect planetary health when they organize effectively against environmental tyranny. From an engineering perspective, I'd learned that protecting renewable energy requires understanding both technical aspects of environmental law and political dynamics of clean energy organizing. The most important lesson was that environmental progress faces systematic opposition from officials who profit from fossil fuel dependence, but communities can defeat institutional environmental obstruction when they document everything, build coalitions, and persist through intimidation designed to exhaust legitimate environmental advocacy. Every morning, when I check my solar panel production statistics with steaming coffee and crisp mountain air, watching clean electricity generation that powers my home without producing